After losing everything to gambling and drugs, I found myself with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few bucks in my pocket. The streets of Las Vegas weren't kind, and I quickly realized that the city of lights could just as easily be the city of nightmares. That's how I ended up in the underground tunnels, a place where the forgotten go to disappear. I'd heard rumors about these tunnels. They say hundreds of people live down there, hiding from the scorching sun, the law, or whatever demons they're running from. It's a different world down there, a place where the rules of society don't apply. I didn't care. I just needed a place to crash, somewhere I could be left alone. I was wandering through the tunnels, trying to find a quiet spot, when I met Betty. Crazy Betty, they called her. She looked like she'd seen better days. Matted hair, sunken eyes, clothes that had probably been worn for weeks. But there was something about her that made you think twice before crossing her. "New here, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy like she'd been smoking since birth. "Yeah," I replied, not in the mood for chit-chat. She sized me up, probably deciding if I was worth her time. "You picked a hell of a place to lay low. But listen, a word of advice, don't go too deep into the tunnels." I shrugged, not really understanding what she meant. "Why's that?" Betty leaned in closer, and I could smell the stench of alcohol on her breath. "People have been disappearing. You go too deep and you might not come back. Just stick to the main areas, stay where the others are, and you'll be fine." I nodded, though her words didn't make much sense to me. I figured she was just trying to spook the new guy. Still, there was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and seriousness, that made me uneasy. "Thanks," I muttered, moving past her to find a spot to settle in. The first few days weren't too bad. It was dark, damp, and smelled like a mix of sewage and mold. But at least it was cooler than the scorching streets above. I kept to myself, just like I always had. But I couldn't help but notice the way people moved around me. Always in groups, always staying within sight of each other. And then there was Betty, who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, always watching, always muttering to herself. One day, I ran into old Charlie. He was a big guy, built like a brick wall with a face that looked like it had been through one too many fights. Word around the tunnels was that Charlie was a bit of a bully, always pushing people around to get what he wanted. And apparently, he wanted my spot. "This is my area," growled, stepping into my space with a sneer. I wasn't in the mood for a fight, but I also wasn't about to let some thug push me around. "I don't see your name on it." Charlie didn't like that. He shoved me hard, sending me stumbling back against the tunnel wall. "You got a mouth on you, huh? Maybe I'll just shut it for you." Before I could react, Betty appeared out of nowhere. "Leave him alone, Charlie," she hissed, her eyes wild. Charlie laughed, a deep, menacing sound. "Mind your business, Betty. This ain't got nothing to do with you." But Betty wasn't backing down. "You mess with him, you mess with me," she said, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. Charlie glared at her, then at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to snap. But then he backed off, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. "Thanks," he said, still shaken. "Don't thank me," Betty replied, her voice suddenly soft. "Just stay out of trouble. And remember what I said. Don't go too deep." That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the way Betty had stood up to Charlie didn't sit right with me. Why would she care what happened to a guy like me? And what was with the warning about the deeper tunnels? I decided I needed to find out for myself. The next day, I ventured a little further into the tunnels. It wasn't long before I noticed a change. The air grew colder, walls narrower, and the smell, it was different, more pungent, almost metallic. The sounds of the others faded, replaced by an eerie silence that sent chills down my spine. I didn't go too far, just enough to satisfy my curiosity. But as I turned back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was Charlie, or what was left of him. His body was lying in a pool of blood, torn apart like some wild animal had gotten to him. His face was frozen in a look of sheer terror, eyes wide open, mouth twisted in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, the sound of something moving in the darkness, something that wasn't human. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I ran, faster than I ever had in my life, back to the main area of the tunnels. When I got there, I found Betty. She saw the look on my face and knew something was wrong. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Charlie, he's dead," I gasped. Something killed him." Betty's face went pale. "I warned you," she whispered, fear etched in every line of her face. "I told you not to go too deep." "What was it?" I demanded. "What's down there?" She didn't answer, just shook her head and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my fear. Whatever was down there, it was real and it was dangerous. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every sound, every shadow seemed like it was coming for me. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe. None of us were. After what happened to Charlie, tunnels felt different. The air was thicker, heavy with fear that you could almost taste. Word spread quickly about his death, though no one dared to speak it aloud. Instead, they whispered. I could feel their eyes on me, like they knew I'd seen something they all feared. Betty wasn't the same after that. She kept to herself, muttering to no one in particular, and her eyes, they were haunted, filled with a dread that hadn't been there before. I tried to talk to her, to get her to tell me what was really going on, but she just shook her head and said, "It's too late. They're here." I didn't know what she meant by they, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But there was no escaping the feeling that something was watching me. Something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of the tunnels. I tried to stay close to the others. Even they were acting strange, more paranoid than usual. People who had been living there for years suddenly packed up and left, disappearing without a word. One night, I woke up to the sound of screaming. At first, I thought it was just another nightmare. God knows I'd been having plenty of those since Charlie's death. This was real, and it was close. I scrambled to my feet and followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. It was Betty. She was standing in the middle of one of the larger chambers, her eyes wild, hair tangled, screaming at the top of her lungs. They're here, the faceless ones." Others had gathered around her, but no one dared to get too close. They all just watched, frozen in fear, as Betty pointed down one of the dark passageways. "They've come for us. They've come to take us away." Before anyone could react, a noise echoed through the tunnels. A low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was coming from the direction Betty was pointing. And then, out of the darkness, I saw them. They moved like shadows, almost blending into the darkness of the tunnels. But as they got closer, I could see them more clearly. These things, they had no faces, smooth, featureless heads that somehow seemed more terrifying than any monster I could have imagined. Their bodies were twisted, humanoid but wrong, like something out of a nightmare. The first one lunged at Betty. She didn't even have time to scream before it was on her, its long, bony fingers wrapping around her throat. I watched in horror as it tore into her, ripping her apart with an inhuman strength that sent blood spraying across the walls. The others started running, but there was no escaping the faceless things. They moved fast, too fast for anyone to get away. I watched as one of the creatures grabbed a man who had been living in the tunnels for years, tearing him to pieces like he was made of paper. The sound of his bones snapping echoed through the chamber, mixed with the wet, sickening sound of flesh being torn apart. I don't know how I managed to move, but somehow, I did. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the tunnels trying to find my way out. Behind me, I could still hear the screams, Betty's screams, the others' screams, the horrifying guttural growls of the faceless things as they hunted us down. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, my only thought to get out, to get away from those things. I could still hear them, their footsteps echoing in the tunnels, getting closer and closer. I turned down a side passage, hoping to lose them, but it was a dead end. Panic set in, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying they wouldn't find me. But then I heard it. The sound of something dragging across the ground, something heavy and wet. I forced myself to look, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was Betty, or what was left of her. Her body was being dragged along the ground by one of the faceless things. Her limbs twisted at unnatural angles, her face frozen in a look of sheer terror. She was still alive, barely, her eyes pleading for help, but there was nothing I could do. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible, as the creature dragged her past me. It didn't notice me. its attention focused on its prize. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. When they were finally gone, I forced myself to move. I stumbled through the tunnels, barely able to see through the tears streaming down my face. Somehow, I found my way back to the main tunnel. But the others were gone, either dead or too scared to stick around. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of those things hunting down anyone left behind. I made it out of the tunnels just before dawn, first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon. But the nightmare didn't end there. I went straight to the nearest police station, desperate to tell someone what had happened. But when I tried to explain, they didn't believe me. They looked at me like I was crazy, just another junkie with a wild story. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't going to help me. They weren't going to do anything. I left the station, defeated and broken, the images of what I'd seen still fresh in my mind. I couldn't stay in the tunnels, not after what happened. So I took to the streets, moving to another part of town, trying to escape the memories, the nightmares that haunted me every time I closed my eyes. But no matter how far I go, I can still hear them. Betty's screams, the sound of her body being torn apart, and those faceless things hunting in the darkness. They're still down there, waiting,